Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. And today on the podcast, we are going to have another listener question from Charlotte. So let's listen in.
Hi, Melanie. It's Charlotte Long Mason. I have a question about spices and herbs. For years, I drank what was called a brain drink, put out by a very well-known doctor. It was almond milk with cinnamon, turmeric, and ginger. Well, since my kidney stones, I've started putting the three in my coffee rather than almond milk. And I would also use a lot of herbs in my cooking, just about everything imaginable. Because two of my doctors have suggested that I use the Mediterranean diet, which I love, and I love all their spices, including sumac. So I'd like to know how these herbs and spices affect kidney stones. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, Charlotte. I definitely wanted to tackle this one on the podcast because I think it brings up a lot of really wonderful points. I think there's kind of two big questions going on. So the first question is kind of about all of these very delicious herbs and supplements that you're using in this brain drink as well in your cooking for the Mediterranean diet. And then the other question is kind of about the Mediterranean diet in general. So I'm going to kind of break up my answer into two separate components, if that's okay, to kind of help organize my thoughts. So for the first piece, I wanted to talk about using these supplements. So you touched on a lot of the supplements that are sort of notoriously, quote, high in oxalate. So things like turmeric, cinnamon, ginger, and almond milk, of course, is also on the higher oxalate side. So I think generally using these supplements in our cooking, so using them in your wonderful, delicious recipes for your Mediterranean diet, or even likely using them in this brain drink or putting them in your coffee, I'm not too concerned about. The amount of oxalate that you're realistically going to get from actual herbs or spices when you're actually eating them is really quite low. I always like to give the example of pepper. So black pepper is also often cited as a spice that's very high in oxalate, but one entire teaspoon of black pepper has about the same amount of oxalate as one baby spinach leaf. So let that sink in, right? So an entire teaspoon of ground black pepper versus one baby spinach leaf. I think whenever we classify foods as, quote, high oxalate or low oxalate, it's so important to put it into context because yes, black pepper is higher in oxalate compared to other spices, but does it really matter, right? Are you actually eating that whole teaspoon of black pepper? Probably not. And even if you did, it's only giving you like 12-ish milligrams of oxalate. So it really isn't giving you any like appreciable or significant amount of oxalate that's going to impact your health. So I would say using all of these spices in your cooking is 1000% okay. I actually never recommend that anyone limit spices when we're talking about using them in cooking, using them in recipes, because again, you're simply just not gonna realistically get enough oxalate to make any difference. As I always say, it's so much more important to make sure you're getting in your calcium to help reduce the oxalate absorption in your intestines versus stressing out over how much oxalate you're eating. So that is point number one. I will sort of give a caveat with this brain drink without knowing the exact recipe of how much turmeric, cinnamon, ginger, and stuff is in there. If you are in fact putting in tablespoons of these things and you're consuming it, you might be getting a bit more than what you would typically get in, say, a pot of curry with that turmeric, right? So I might be concerned about that. I would have to see your 24-hour urine test and see if your urine oxalate is even high to see if we even need to be worried about this in the first place. But my gut says that it's likely okay. Really, the only time I get nervous about the oxalate in these foods like cinnamon or turmeric is when people are taking them in supplement form. This tends to come up most often with turmeric or curcumin. There have been some curcumin supplements that have been tested to be oxalate free. I question whether that's true or not. As we know, it's really difficult to measure the oxalate in food, and so I wonder if the methods that these companies are using to test their oxalate are really accurate. As we know, it's just so difficult to know. And the reason in general that I get worried about oxalate in supplements is because it's simply a super concentrated source. That's the point of the supplement, right? You're going to be getting a whole lot more turmeric in that supplement or pill, or a whole lot more cinnamon, versus if you were using a tablespoon of that turmeric in a whole pot of curry or sprinkling some cinnamon on your oatmeal, right? There's just a lot in there. So it's potentially a very concentrated source of that oxalate. And I have definitely seen urine oxalates be very high as a result of these things because they go down when people stop taking these supplements. So as always, we need to look at a 24-hour urine test to see if oxalate is even a concern. I know that many people take turmeric supplements or curcumin supplements for a wide variety of reasons and say that they are beneficial, and I don't ever want to take things away that people think are helpful for them, of course, but I do want to look at your urine test and make sure that we're not seeing anything that's off that might be able to be fixed with those supplements. So bottom line when it comes to supplements is using them in cooking, completely fine. Literally any of them. All the ones that you mentioned, Charlotte. So turmeric, cinnamon, ginger, black pepper I'm going to throw in because people often sort of demonize that for stone prevention. I don't care about any of them. In fact, I love that you use them in your cooking because they make your food delicious and I want you to enjoy your food. As I often say that I'm a dietitian because I'm a foodie myself and I love to eat, and I want everyone to be able to enjoy eating. I think that is a basic human right that everyone deserves. And if we are putting people on such restrictive diets that they feel afraid to eat and feel that they have to eat super bland food, that is no fun, and it certainly doesn't have to be that way with kidney stones or any other health condition for that matter. And so I love that you're using these herbs and spices because it just makes your food taste really good and enjoyable, and that's a beautiful thing. And also we know that for many people, eating too much salt is a big sort of driver of stone formation that can drive up your urine calcium. And so using herbs and spices is always my number one recommendation for people who need to limit sodium to help make their food taste very good. And so moving over to the Mediterranean diet piece of your question, just sort of as a whole, we already talked about the herbs and spices, but just kind of the Mediterranean diet as a dietary pattern in general. I actually love the Mediterranean diet. I typically refer to two different dietary patterns, and they're honestly very similar. I often refer to the Mediterranean diet pattern and something called the DASH, or Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension dietary pattern. And honestly, they are both very similar. Both of these dietary patterns really encourage a lot of fruits and vegetables. That is a hallmark, especially of the DASH, but definitely of a Mediterranean diet as well. They really encourage, I'm going to use the term plant-based. They are definitely not necessarily vegetarian or vegan dietary patterns, but they definitely encourage lots of fruits and vegetables. They also both stress the importance of whole grains, beans, nuts, seeds. The Mediterranean diet, of course, really puts an emphasis on olive oil and those other heart-healthy fats, and seasoning with the herbs and spices, as you mentioned, Charlotte. They both tend to limit some of the things that we know aren't the best for kidney stones. So eating lots of red meat, for example, added sugar, and lots of added salt. So both of these dietary patterns in my mind are very similar, and they both are actually wonderful for a wide variety of things. Oftentimes the Mediterranean diet is brought up for like cancer prevention, and heart health is probably the biggest thing that it's known for. There's also research to show that it might help reduce the risk of cognitive decline as we get older, and things like Alzheimer's disease, and so all sorts of really wonderful things. And there's actually data to suggest that it reduces the risk of kidney stones as well. And notice I mentioned a lot of very high oxalate foods on a Mediterranean diet. Both a Mediterranean diet and a DASH diet are gonna be higher in oxalate simply because oxalate comes in a lot of those really healthy foods, those fruits, those vegetables, those beans and nuts and seeds. But we see time and time again that these dietary patterns that are actually on the higher oxalate side are associated with a lower risk of stones. I wanted to briefly review for those people that are science nerds like me, a paper that came out in 2020 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This is one of the more recent studies that has shown that this Mediterranean diet pattern specifically is associated with a lower risk of stones. So these researchers, I'll put a link to this paper in the show notes if you want to read the whole thing. But basically, these researchers looked at tons of people, so over 200,000 people from some of the really big health cohorts that we use for data like this. Something called the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study and the Nurses Health Study 1 and 2. So they looked at all these people. And they look to see how much do they eat like a Mediterranean diet. They actually give people's dietary patterns a diet score. So basically score them in how consistently they're eating with what they define as a Mediterranean diet. There's not like an official Mediterranean diet way of eating. Like I said, this is all sort of like dietary patterns, but there are official scores that we use for research in papers like this to kind of help us quantify these eating patterns. Because if you've been around me for a while, you know that nutrition isn't necessarily straightforward. It's really more about sort of these patterns and not eating XYZ foods or not eating XYZ foods. So for research purposes, we kind of have to put a number to it. So they develop these diet scores basically to say hey, these people are eating more like a Mediterranean diet versus not, right? So basically, they found that people who were in this giant study, they followed them for a long period of time, and they looked to see how many people got kidney stones. And they found that people who were eating a diet that was most like a Mediterranean diet had a 30% reduced chance of getting kidney stones compared to people who were not following a Mediterranean diet, who are least following a Mediterranean diet, if that makes sense. So that's significant, a 30% lower chance of forming kidney stones in a dietary pattern that is likely going to be higher in oxalate. So you might be thinking oh my goodness, how in the world could they be having less kidney stones when they're eating more oxalate, right? Because I know that the oxalate piece of kidney stone nutrition is stressed ad nauseum, likely at your doctor's office as well as on Dr. Google. And I love this study because they actually took sort of a few people in this cohort. So that only about 6,000 people, 6,500 people had 24-hour urine tests. So we could actually look at their urine chemistry and see what's actually going on in their urine that made them less likely to form stones. And as I always say, higher oxalate foods are full of other really good things. And so yes, maybe you're going to be eating more oxalate, but you're also going to be getting a lot of other good things for stone prevention. So specifically, they found that people who were eating a diet most like a Mediterranean diet had higher citrate in their urine, which makes sense because the best thing that you can do to get more citrate in your urine is eat fruits and vegetables. All of them, all fruits and vegetables are going to help increase citrate in your urine. So people that followed a Mediterranean diet had more citrate. They had more magnesium, which we know tends to be a really good thing for oxalate stone prevention. They had higher urine volume. So perhaps people who follow a Mediterranean diet drink more water, but maybe they're also getting more fluid from all of those wonderful fruits and vegetables as well. They also had less acid in their urine, and they also had more oxalate in their urine, which makes sense because they were likely eating more oxalate with those whole grains and fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds. But the most important thing is, of course, that they formed less kidney stones, but also when we look at something called supersaturation numbers in their urine. So supersaturation numbers, if you've ever had a 24-hour urine test, especially one that's done by Litholink, which is a pretty popular company for urine testing here in the United States, these numbers sort of are basically a risk factor that you're going to form a kidney stone. They take all of the other numbers in that 24-hour urine test and kind of put them in this fancy equation and spit out essentially a risk of forming calcium oxalate, calcium phosphate, and uric acid stones. And they found that people who were eating a Mediterranean diet had lower supersaturations, a lower risk of forming calcium oxalate, calcium phosphate, and uric acid stones, all of the most common types of stones, despite having higher urine oxalate, because all of that other good stuff in their urine was so much higher. They also tended to eat less salt, which also helped the situation, right? And so that was a lot of very, very sciencey, nerdy information to kind of help you understand a little bit about why I don't necessarily want all of us eating a low oxalate diet, because when we do, we're inevitably going to be cutting out a lot of other really, really important things, both for general health as well as for kidney stone prevention. As always, the oxalate thing especially is so individualized to each of you and your 24-hour urine test. For most people, honestly, I don't even care about oxalate. I want us to be getting in enough calcium. 9 times out of 10, urine oxalate comes tumbling down if we just make sure we're getting in enough calcium. If it doesn't, then yeah, we might get a little bit more picky with oxalate and maybe dive in a little bit deeper and see like, oh yeah, are you getting these very high doses of oxalate, maybe from these supplements. I've seen that before. Or maybe you're taking excess vitamin C supplements, which then your body can make oxalate out of. Right. But the point is with kidney stone prevention, for most of us, it's just looking at this sort of overall dietary pattern. And we want to be eating a varied, well-balanced diet that includes many, many plant foods like a Mediterranean diet. The Mediterranean diet, again, is often recommended for heart health and lots of other just kind of like general health stuff. But there's actually many studies. I just cited this one that was published in 2020, but there's many other studies that have found similar results, that a Mediterranean diet and again this other dietary pattern called DASH are associated with a much lower risk of kidney stones because they're full of all of these really, really wonderful things. So Charlotte, I hope that helps. That was a very, very long answer to what you probably thought was going to be a very simple question, but if you know me, I like to kind of dive in and show us the science and see what the data really says and help us understand why I'm making this recommendation and why I'm saying, yes, it's okay to eat beans and seeds and whatever it is. So thank you again for your question, Charlotte. If any listeners out there would like to submit a question for a chance that it would be answered on the podcast, there is a link in the show notes. I would love to hear from you and get some more podcast inspiration. I want this podcast to be helpful for you. And if you are submitting questions, then obviously I'm helping you get your questions answered. So thank you as always for tuning in to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. I can't wait to help you prevent stones and live your best life. Happy eating and have a wonderful day.